it is very difficult to build a common good with money, with capital. And that's because under conditions of capitalism, there is a tendency for money to dominate, and the common good is an extremely important thing. I have sort of dedicated my life to it in some ways, and it's based on this idea of non-domination, that there is difference, and it is possible to have a reconciliation of those differences through negotiation. And the fundamental form that takes in the world is to have a balance of interests between conflicting and different perspectives. So from the point of view, in a way, of Catholic social thought coming out of that, that money is to be understood as a power, and money and capital is to be understood as something which seeks to dominate. Now, obviously, I used to get into more trouble before Pope Francis, now less trouble, which is not necessarily a good thing, Philip, for working so closely with the church from within Labour. And people say, it's patriarchal, it's, full of sex abuse, it's basically a terrible thing. And I always used to say that, well, at least I used to say, the church doesn't think that the free market created the world. That there's something anterior and inherited there about creation. And what I'm saying with money and with capital and its power is that there is, in a way, an attempt to commodify creation. I just want to say that commodification is not a word that I use before 2:30 in the afternoon. It's a kind of ugly word. I just haven't been able to find an alternative to it. And commodification is the process by which something that's not produced for sale, nature, a human being, is turned into a commodity with a price through land markets, labour markets, and those things. So what's always been at stake in the relationship of the common good with money is the ability to resist the domination of money, because there is a tendency, and I'll just give this as a counter story to your story. I think that a large part of what Philip said was right about state regulation and state interference consolidating trends. But what was missing in the account is the actual way in which capital itself centralizes and consolidates the power of money. And the example I would give is the parallel example to the one that Philip gave, is the disintegration of a diverse, regionally based and mutually owned financial system. And the example I'd give is actually apposite for today, given the fact that that Newcastle were relegated last night, is the example of the Northern Counties Permanent Building Society. So the Northern Counties Permanent Building Society was founded as a mutual, that is, that everybody put in, and on the whole, the people who put in, it was founded in Newcastle, were dispossessed peasants in the enclosure movement, where people who lived on their land through customary practice were expelled from their land due to freehold title, which is part of the power of money. They were forcibly removed from their homes, and they in order to have a home in the world, they created this, it's really that very beautiful name, and it mocks us in many ways, the Northern Counties Permanent Building Society. And they put in, and through the shared risk and the shared contribution, they were able to buy a home in the world, and were able to recreate and claim a home. Now the Northern Counties Permanent Building Society grew, and it grew through many generations. It grew through 4 really serious depressions, and I really don't want to spoil and there was another building society in the area called the Rock Building Society, so you can see in what way the story is going. And in 1961 they merged to become Northern Rock Building Society. Now this was an institution. This is the point that it was embedded, it was trusted, it was locally owned. In fact, it had an entire philanthropic arm that used to fund people to go to university. It was kind of linked with the labour movement in some ways, as so many things are. So, for example, during the miners' strike, they suspended the need for payment for strikers' families on their homes so that they wouldn't lose their homes. Now, what I'm saying is that, and this is not a partisan party point at all, as you can see from what I'm saying, is that Northern Rock was demutualised in 1997, a symbolic year in many ways. And the point is that it became the fourth largest mortgage lender in the country. It was the sponsor of Newcastle United football team. And the reality of that was that through, and it was said, all those things that Philip said, that it was inefficient, that it wasn't using its capital correctly, there was a massive deregulation. And the point being is that a 150-year-old asset embedded in the local economy, shared and controlled by local people, when it was demutualised and privatised, the asset was lost in 10 years. And now Newcastle United are sponsored by Wonga. And that's another form of money power, which is a usurious money power. And Wonga begin their loans, as we know, at 5,000%. Now you could say, and free market economists do say, well, that's a voluntary contractual relationship. But it is the case, and this is why it's so difficult to create a common good money. When there is a contract between people who have money and people who do not have money, and the necessities of life demand that you have money, then the free nature of that contract is compromised. There is an element of the manipulation of needs that leads people to get into very serious distress. So what I'm saying is that there is a tendency for capital to centralise power. So not one of the mutual building societies that were demutualised in the 80s and the 90s now exists as an independent financial institution. So I don't know, standing in a church, I'm hesitant to say it, but I'm quite old. So do any of you remember The Exorcist, the film The Exorcist with Damien, and 666 was the thing. Well, that's what we have. We have 6 banks, 6 telecom companies, 6 of everything. So we're genuinely living in an age of oligopoly, of a concentration of power. And when I said earlier that there's a tendency to compromise, to commodify creation, what we are witnessing is that increasingly that power is stronger and extends its reach to other things. So my view is there's far less resistance, Philip, to that because of the disintegration of the civic institutions that were embedded within the economy. So that's the counter narrative I'm giving to Philip, is that the centralisation of money power is not exclusively to do with state regulation and state interference. There is also a tendency for financial institutions to grow, and you can absolutely see the issue here in the City of London. So everybody celebrated, well, not everybody celebrated, but a few people celebrated last week Sadiq Khan winning the mayoral election to become the mayor of London. Only nobody really mentioned that he's not the mayor of the City of London, that there is a mayor of the City of London. And that's a very interesting story, because while Sadiq Khan's London is a sort of, he's got a committee of 15 people called something like the GLA, which is supposed to hold him accountable, that was created by New Labour after Margaret Thatcher abolished the GRC, which obviously in retrospect we can completely understand. And it's not even called a city, it's called a Greater London Authority. It has no city status. Sometimes in my more mischievous moments I'm tempted to lead a campaign to have London recognised as a city, like Brighton or something, or Norwich, or, even Durham, But London is not a city, he's just elected, and the City of London itself is the oldest continuous democratic institution in Europe. So, it kind of relates to the story that I told you about when William the Conqueror came to London. He came friendly, and he allowed the city to keep English, it allowed the city to keep its law courts. He didn't impose the sovereignty on London. London remained a free city, but the rest of the country was put into freehold land ownership, was essentially held by the conquerors. That played out in the enclosures, because ultimately what happened is that the landowners imposed their ownership to maximise their return on the land and evicted the people who lived on it. But that wasn't the case with London. London retained its status as a city, and London did, over the course of its history, massively important things: democratic hustings, a preservation of democracy, a common law that was protected in London. And we know that London was extremely important in resisting the domination of the king, of King Charles, when he tried to impose divine right and tried to impose personal royal rule. The City of London resisted that and supported the parliamentary side. So what you have is a very interesting story where London as a city does resist the domination by the monarchy, but increasingly the City of London, and this is, as we know, exacerbated after the Great Fire when the population was essentially removed and didn't come back. The City of London became a centre of finance. And how do you build a common good with that? Only the City of London, for example, has a lobbyist. He is not personally the oldest lobbyist in Britain, but the Post, the Remembrancer, is the eldest post in Britain. And the Remembrancer is allowed to enter the floor of the House of Commons, for example, in order to brief members. You know, it's not every council, City of London, not every council that the Prime Minister comes once a year to give a speech on, and the Chancellor comes once a year to the Mansion House to give a speech. The City of London has represented the interests of money, and even when it came that London itself, after hundreds of years of resisting its form, elected a mayor, that mayor still has no status in the city. What I'm saying to you is that that there is power in capital, that it lobbies, that it has an address, and that address is here, and it has been very, very difficult to establish a common good with the City of London, where they are prepared to share power with the rest of London, and certainly they have resisted the idea of being part of a greater London. So I think it's important that thinking politically, that it cannot be the case that there is a city within our city that exclusively represents the interests of money, that is not a healthy thing in a democracy. And I think it's time to think quite imaginatively about how to think about London in terms of a common good. But then to go back to the way that this process of commodification takes place, and to link that up with the common good, and particularly the mutual interest that Philip and I have in Catholic social thought, is, capitalism is based on the maximum returns on investment. And that is why there is enormous pressure that builds up to turn nature itself and human beings into a commodity that are exploited. What's essential, I believe, in the Catholic tradition and the Christian tradition more widely, is that there is this concept of a person that is not exhausted by that status. And the way that is resisted is by building civic institutions like trade unions, like universities, where workers have a status. Now, what's laudable about the German economy, Philip, in my view, is not its system of regulation. It's nothing to do actually with that, although I do think that there are excellent things about the retention of local banks. They still have retained a local banking system with the Sparkassen. The two elements that are superb in the German economy is that they are not state-directed. The first is the representation of the workforce in corporate governance, that there is a understanding of public corporations, as a body, as a corporazione, as a body, whereby the workforce are represented at the level of power. Now, if you look at corporate restructurings In Britain and Germany, they do tell a different story. And they tell a story that's less favourable to management and slightly more favourable to the security and the well-being of the workers. So I think that that's a wonderful thing that grows out of Catholic social thought. So that's not about the balance between finance and the real economy, that's about the organisation of the firm. And the second thing that I find laudable in the German economy is its sense of vocation, that the training of people and the concept of a calling, of the dignity of labour and the dignity of work, that means that you are not exclusively an economic unit, but you are also a human unit in that. Now, I think that there's a compatibility that we could talk about the humanisation of capital, but what I want to draw is that the threat of dehumanisation is very strong in that people are only considered as commodities and dispensable and not considered in terms of their vocation. And to conclude, it's just very necessary for us to bear in mind that there are, in this fallen world, which I shared with Philip, I'm not comparing to perfection, in a fallen world, there can be incentives to virtue and incentives to vice. And that what happens with the maximisation of returns, what happens when there's a lack of effective accountability, because what happened in 2008 overwhelmingly was a lack of any form of accountability, and when people are not accountable, there is a tendency to cheat, there is a tendency to lie, there is a tendency to steal, and a tendency to exaggerate. We know this, and so what there was a crisis of relationship. So what I'm saying is that the common good would require the representation of workers on the boards in order to hold a degree of accountability for capital, and that it would in no way interfere with a price system, but what it would say is that human beings and nature are not exclusively commodities, and we should not consider them in that way. And what we were left with from the crash was a very considerable amount of debt, a very considerable deficit, and a widespread demoralisation, which is still not sorted out.